You walked into the store for one thing: milk. Just milk. 20 minutes later, you're standing in line holding 7 items you never planned to buy. A candy bar you didn't want an hour ago. A magazine you'll never open. A bag of chips shaped like a pyramid, glowing under the fluorescent light like it was placed there just for you. It was. You think you chose all of it. You didn't. Your brain made most of those decisions before you ever knew a decision was happening, and the truth is stranger than that. Some of your choices are decided by your brain before you're even conscious of choosing at all, not choosing badly, not choosing carelessly, choosing after the choice was already made. What if the feeling of choosing was never proof that you were the one doing it? You've been told your whole life that you're the author of your own actions. You wake up. You decide to check your phone. You decide to open the app that upsets you the most. You decide to scroll for 11 more minutes than you meant to. Every one of those decisions feels like it started inside you, in some quiet control room behind your eyes where a small, deliberate version of you weighs the options and picks. But that control room might be empty. Or worse, it might just be a viewing room, a place where you watch decisions after they've already been made and mistake the replay for the moment of choice. This isn't a metaphor for a bad day. This is measurable. Scientists have watched it happen inside a healthy, functioning human brain in real time on a screen. And what they found should unsettle anyone who has ever said the words, "I decided." Here's the strange part. Your brain isn't lying to you out of malice. It's lying to you because lying, in this very specific sense, kept your ancestors alive. Imagine a version of you standing in tall grass 60,000 years ago. Something rustles to your left. You don't have time to convene a committee. You don't have time to weigh the pros and cons of running versus freezing versus checking which regional predators are active this time of year. Your body has already moved before the thinking part of you finishes the sentence. Wait, was that gap? The space between the body acting and the mind narrating used to be the entire difference between surviving the grass and becoming part of it. Brains that deliberated too long got eaten. Brains that acted first and explained later got to have children. You are quite literally descended from the second kind. So evolution didn't build you a brain that decides consciously and then acts. It built you a brain that acts, mostly unconsciously, and then constructs a tidy little story about why you decided to do it. The story isn't a bug. The story is the product. It's what lets you feel like a coherent person instead of a bundle of fast, disconnected reflexes stitched together after the fact. Psychologists have a name for the part of your mind running most of this show without asking permission. Daniel Kahneman called it System 1, the fast, automatic, intuitive machinery that reacts before you can blink, while a slower, effortful System 2 lags behind, checking the math, feeling important, mostly rubber, stamping decisions that were never really up for debate in the first place. Here's a question worth sitting with. If the fast system is making the call and the slow system is just writing the press release afterward, which one is actually you? Most people assume the two systems take turns, that thinking happens first and acting follows. But Kahneman's decades of research suggested something closer to the opposite arrangement most of the time. System 1 runs constantly, effortlessly, silently, making thousands of small judgments a day about what's safe, what's appealing, what's worth your attention. System 2 only gets summoned for the hard cases, and even then, it often just confirms what System 1 already leaned toward, dressing an intuition up in the language of logic. You can feel this yourself if you're honest. Think of the last time you were sure about something within half a second of being asked, and only afterward found reasons to justify it. That half second wasn't you thinking, that was System 1 deciding, and System 2 arriving late to the party with a clipboard. This division isn't a flaw hiding somewhere in a broken brain. It's the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. A mind that deliberated consciously over every single choice, from which foot to step with first, to whether that shadow across the room was dangerous, would never finish a single day. Consciousness is slow because it's expensive, metabolically costly, drawing on limited glucose and limited attention. So your brain spends that expensive resource sparingly, reserving it for the rare problems that actually need it, and quietly automating everything else, including a surprising number of things you'd swear under oath you thought carefully about. In 1983, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet decided to test exactly when a decision happens inside the brain. His setup was almost embarrassingly simple. He asked people to sit in front of a clock with a fast-moving dot, flex their wrist whenever they felt the spontaneous urge to do so, and note the exact position of the dot at the moment they felt themselves decide to move. Meanwhile, electrodes on their scalp were recording something called the readiness potential, a slow build of electrical activity in the brain that reliably shows up right before a voluntary movement. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The readiness potential appeared in the brain a few hundred milliseconds before people reported feeling like they'd made the decision to move, not after. Before, the brain was already committing to the action while the conscious mind was still catching up, still preparing to believe it had just made a free, spontaneous choice. A few hundred milliseconds doesn't sound like much, but multiply that gap across every decision you make in a single day, and you start to see something troubling. Not that you have zero influence over your life, you do, but that the moment you experience as choosing might actually be closer to a headline written after the story already happened, rather than the story itself. Later researchers pushed this further, using brain scanners instead of scalp electrodes, and found patterns in the brain's frontal and parietal regions that could predict, with real accuracy, whether someone was about to press a button with their left hand or their right hand seconds before the person felt they'd chosen. Seconds, not milliseconds. Seconds. So if a machine reading nothing but patterns of blood flow in your skull can know your choice before you do, what exactly is the you that shows up afterward? Feeling so certain it was in charge the whole time, you might be telling yourself that button presses are trivial, that this is different from real decisions, the ones that actually matter, like what you buy, who you trust, what you believe. Surely those are safe from this kind of manipulation. They are not. If anything, they're easier to hijack because they don't happen inside a quiet lab with electrodes taped to your scalp. They happen in supermarkets, apps, and hallways engineered by people who understand exactly how little conscious control you have in the moment and who have built entire careers around that gap. Consider a study run by the psychologist Sheena Iyengar, sometimes called the jam study. Researchers set up a tasting booth in an upscale grocery store, alternating between a display of 24 different jams and a display of only 6. The bigger display drew more attention, more people stopping to look, more curiosity, more browsing. But when it came time to actually buy, something flipped. Only about 3% of shoppers who saw the 24 jams made a purchase. Among those who saw just 6, nearly a third bought something. More choice didn't create more freedom. It created paralysis dressed up as freedom, a brain so overwhelmed by options that it quietly opted out of deciding at all, while still feeling the whole time like it was the one carefully weighing every jar on the table. Doesn't that feel backwards? Shouldn't more options always mean more control? Not if your brain treats overwhelming choice as a threat to be avoided rather than a puzzle to be solved, somewhere behind the polite feeling of, I'll just think about it. The actual decision had already been made. Walk away. Buy nothing, preserve the mental energy, and the story your mind tells you afterward is that you were being thoughtful, careful, discerning. Not that you were, in the most literal sense, cognitively fleeing the scene. It gets stranger. Your choices aren't only shaped by how many options you're given, they're shaped by things you never even noticed you encountered in the first place. In a now famous experiment, the psychologist John Bargh had participants unscramble sets of words to form grammatically correct sentences. One group's word sets were quietly loaded with concepts related to old age. Words like wrinkle, Florida, forgetful, bingo, gray. Nothing about walking, nothing about speed, just words associated in the shared cultural background of most participants' minds with being elderly. Afterward, researchers secretly timed how long it took each participant to walk down the hallway toward the elevator. The group primed with old age words walked measurably slower than the group given neutral words. Not because they were told to. Not because they consciously noticed anything happening to them at all. Their behavior changed physically in their own legs based on a handful of words they'd already forgotten reading minutes earlier, and they had absolutely no idea it had happened. If a stray word about bingo can change the speed of your own legs without your permission and without your awareness, how much of the rest of your day is being quietly written by inputs you never consciously registered at all? It gets even stranger than a slower walk down a hallway. It turns out your brain won't just act on decisions you never noticed making. It will actively defend decisions you never made at all. A researcher named Petter Johansson ran an experiment built almost like a magic trick. Participants were shown pairs of photographs, two faces at a time, and asked which face they found more attractive. After choosing, they were handed the photo they'd supposedly picked and asked to explain out loud why they preferred it, except sometimes through a simple sleight of hand using a two-sided card. The researchers secretly swapped the photo. Participants ended up holding the face they had actually rejected moments earlier, believing it was the one they'd chosen. Most people didn't notice the swap at all. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you. They didn't just fail to notice. They confidently explained why they'd chosen a face they had, in reality, just turned down. They pointed to the eyes, the smile, some quality that clearly drew them in, defending a decision that was never theirs, with the same conviction they'd have used for a decision that was. Researchers call this choice blindness, and it suggests something far more unsettling than a slow walk down a hallway. It suggests your sense of why I chose this isn't a memory at all. It's a story generated on demand, built fresh in the moment you're asked to explain yourself, using whatever evidence happens to be sitting in your hand. If your own mind can construct a heartfelt justification for a choice you never actually made, how much confidence should you really place in the reasons you give for the choices you did make? This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. It's not just that decisions get made a fraction of a second before you notice them. It's that the inputs shaping those decisions can slip past your awareness entirely, doing their work in the dark, and you'll still walk away afterward fully convinced the choice, whatever it was, came from some untouched, sovereign part of you sitting calmly at the center of your mind. There is no sovereign part waiting quietly in the center. There is only a very convincing narrator working with incomplete information, filling in the gaps with confidence instead of accuracy, because confidence feels better and costs nothing. And once you understand that, you start to see why entire industries have been built quietly and very deliberately around exploiting exactly this gap between the deciding and the noticing. The economist Richard Taylor and the legal scholar Cass Sunstein gave this phenomenon a name that sounds almost gentle. They called it a nudge, a small change in how choices are presented that predictably shifts behavior without ever removing an option or forcing a decision outright. The nudge doesn't argue with you. It doesn't have to. It just quietly rearranges the furniture of your decision before you ever walk into the room. Consider organ donation. In countries where citizens must actively check a box to become a donor, enrollment often sits below 15%. In countries with nearly identical populations, similar cultures, similar values, where the box is already checked and citizens must actively opt out instead, enrollment often exceeds 90%. Same people, same organs, same beating hearts doing the actual deciding. The only thing that changed was which choice required effort and which one required none. You'd like to think a decision this significant about your own body after your own death would be immune to something as small as a pre-checked box. It isn't. Almost nothing is. This same principle is sitting quietly behind nearly every screen you touch. Streaming services don't ask if you want to watch another episode. The next one simply begins counting down from a small number in the corner, and stopping it requires you to notice, reach out, and actively intervene against a decision that's already been made for you by default in advance by someone who has never met you. Every additional second you don't move your hand is a second the platform gets to quietly claim as your choice. Retailers use a related trick called the decoy effect, something the behavioral economist Dan Ariely documented in careful, repeated detail. Offer two subscription options, and people split roughly evenly, agonizing over which one is worth the money. Add a third option, deliberately overpriced and clearly inferior, positioned right next to the most expensive real option, and something remarkable happens. People don't choose the decoy. Almost nobody does, but its mere presence makes the expensive option beside it look like the obvious, reasonable, almost generous choice by comparison, and sales of that pricier tier climb, sometimes dramatically, sometimes by double digits. The decoy was never meant to be picked. It was meant to change what picking felt like, to make one option seem sensible, purely by standing next to something worse. You walked into that decision believing you were comparing two plans on their honest merits. You were actually comparing a real plan to a manufactured shadow built by someone else for the specific purpose of making your free choice bend in a particular profitable direction. Grocery stores have understood this for decades, arranging entire buildings around the predictable weaknesses of a distracted, tired, mildly hungry human brain. Milk and eggs sit at the far back corner, guaranteeing a walk past 100 other tempting displays before you reach them. Checkout lines are lined with small, cheap, high-sugar items, positioned exactly where your willpower is at its lowest, after the mental effort of shopping has already worn it down to nothing. None of this requires you to be foolish, weak-willed, or careless. It only requires you to be human, running the same fast, pattern-matching story-writing machinery that once kept your ancestors alive in tall grass, now aimed at a shelf of candy positioned 2 feet from a register. Even the notifications buzzing quietly in your pocket right now were designed with this same gap in mind. The vibration arrives before you consciously decide to check it. Your hand is often already moving toward the phone before the thought, "I should check that," fully forms in language. Engineers who study attention for a living know this. They know that the reach happens first, and the justification gets built in the half second after, the same way Libet's participants believed they decided to move their wrist a moment before their own brain proves otherwise. Notice how none of these systems ever need to force you into anything. Force would require your awareness, and awareness is exactly the thing being routed around. A locked door announces itself. A checked box does not. A forced purchase would trigger resistance. A candy bar sitting quietly at eye level, 2 feet from where you're already standing bored in line, triggers nothing at all, and that's precisely the point. The most effective influence over a decision-making brain is the kind that never has to announce itself as influence. Think about the last subscription you signed up for. Somewhere in the process, there was almost certainly a moment where canceling required more steps than joining. A phone call instead of a click. A confirmation screen designed to look identical to the cancel button until you looked closely enough to notice it wasn't. None of this is accidental. It's built by people who understand with real precision that the friction of an extra step is often all it takes to make your fast, tired, distracted brain choose to stay rather than leave, and then quietly tell you afterward that staying was what you wanted anyway. So here's the uncomfortable center of all this, the version of you that walks into a store, opens an app, scrolls a feed, or signs a subscription, believing the whole time it's exercising free, deliberate choice, is often responding to forces it never consciously perceived, deciding before it knows it's deciding, and narrating the whole event afterward as though it had been fully in control from the very first moment. Does that mean you have no freedom at all? Not exactly. It means the freedom you actually have doesn't live in the split second of choosing. It lives earlier than that, and it's quieter than that. The real leverage point isn't the moment you stand in front of the shelf, or the moment the next episode starts its countdown, or the moment your thumb hovers over a glowing notification. By then, the fast system has usually already won, and the slow system is just there to write the caption. The real leverage point is in designing your environment before you ever arrive at that moment, deciding in advance what your defaults will be so that the automatic, unconscious machinery running most of your life is at least running toward something you actually chose back when you had the clarity to choose it. Turn off autoplay before the countdown ever starts. Leave your card at home before you walk past the candy. Put the phone in another room before the notification even has a chance to arrive. Decide in a calm, unhurried moment what you'll do in the noisy one because the noisy one will never be run by the thoughtful version of you. It will be run by the fast, ancient, pattern-matching version, the one built for tall grass and rustling shadows, now navigating checkout lines and infinite scrolls, still acting a fraction of a second before it knows why. Maybe that's the real definition of freedom, the only version that actually survives contact with a nervous system built like this, not being the one who consciously decides in the moment. Almost nobody actually is, no matter how certain it feels, but being the one who quietly designs the moment long before it arrives so that whatever your brain ends up deciding without asking your permission, it was still, in some earlier and more honest sense, something you chose. This isn't a call to distrust every decision you'll ever make. That would be its own kind of paralysis, its own 24 jams laid out on a table, offering you nothing but the freedom to freeze. It's an invitation to notice where the real decision actually happens, not in the aisle, not in the app, not in the half second before your thumb moves. Earlier than that, in the quiet, unhurried moments when you decide what your environment will look like, what your defaults will be, what your phone will and won't be allowed to do while you sleep 3 feet away from it. You cannot outthink a readiness potential that fires before you're aware of it. You cannot outthink a decoy option engineered by people who tested 100 versions before landing on the one that works on you specifically. But you can, in a calmer hour, decide which grass you're willing to walk into and which shelves you'd rather never pass at all. You walked into the store for one thing, milk. But by the time you reached the register, something else had already decided the rest somewhere behind your eyes a few hundred milliseconds before you ever knew there was a decision to make at all.